Hello and welcome. I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching The World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top headlines of the hour. Chinese President Xi Jinping held his first formal talks with Japan's new Prime Minister Sumy at the APEC summit in South Korea. Seen as a China hawk, Takaichi has toned down her rhetoric on Beijing after taking office earlier last week. Israel returns the bodies of 30 Palestinians to Gaza as part of an ongoing exchange deal under a US-brokered ceasefire plan. The action follows the return of the remains of 2 deceased Israeli hostages earlier today. Yemen's Houthi authorities announced 43 UN staffers will face trial over alleged links to an Israeli airstrike, while at least 59 staff remain detained, complicating humanitarian aid delivery across Houthi-controlled regions. US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth meets with counterparts from China and India, beginning a series of face-to-face meetings at the ASEAN Defense Summit in Malaysia. This follows Washington seeking to bolster regional security ties in the Indo-Pacific. Russia's Defense Ministry announces the capture of Novooleksandrivka in Ukraine's Dnipropetrovsk region, while Russia launches an overnight attack on the northeastern city of Sumy, escalating the conflict further. The United States has cancelled a planned Budapest summit between US President Trump and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin. This comes after a tense call between the country's 2 top diplomats and Putin's hardline stance regarding territorial demands. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has denounced Russia's massive drone strike on Ukraine's thermal plant that claimed 3 lives. Zelensky has said that it's outright terror and that the world must respond to the warfare. Pakistan and Afghanistan are set to return to the negotiating table on the 6th of November in Istanbul. Despite talks breaking down earlier, both countries have now decided to extend the fragile ceasefire along the 2,600-kilometre border until the next meeting. We start this hour in West Asia, and Israel's military chief, Lieutenant Eyal Zamir, has announced a new round of senior appointments across the Israel Defense Forces. The IDF has said that all the appointments were approved by Defense Minister Israel Katz. The latest reshuffle includes 35 new colonels and the reassignment of 20 existing colonels to new positions at the same rank. In addition, 3 senior officers will be sent for academic studies before taking on new roles. The announcement comes after a previous round of appointments sparked tensions between Zamir and Defense Minister Katz, who criticised the Chief of Staff for not consulting him ahead of time. We are now joined by Dan Perry. He is a political analyst and he joins us live from Tel Aviv. Dan, thank you very much for joining us. Of course, remains continue to be handed over both sides. We've seen 30 Palestinian remains handed over today after those 2 Israeli remains were handed over this morning. However, in regards to the Israel Defense Forces, there has been a major reshuffle. Why has this happened?
Thomas, I don't think I would qualify this as a reshuffle. It's not like the head of intelligence was kicked out or there's a new head of the Air Force or Navy. These are periodic appointments as part of the regular churn. And what is remarkable is not the identity of the several dozen new officers who were raised by 1 rank, but the fact that the Army made a point of saying that it was done in conjunction with the Defense Ministry, which I don't recall ever before. This reflects what has been increasing tension between a series of military leaderships and the current government of Benjamin Netanyahu. And this is happening because the leadership of the military has been at loggerheads with the government about pretty much almost everything about the war strategy after the first, second, or third month. The military has been saying for over a year in leaks to reporters that they believe the war has accomplished all that it could in Gaza. And in general, the atmosphere in Israel has been one of great suspicion that Netanyahu is prolonging the war because this is demanded by the far-right parties that had the power to bring down his coalition. So basically, you have tensions in Israel between the military and the government. It doesn't mean what it might in other countries that are less stable as democracies, where you might think of a military coup or such a thing. In Israel, that would be fantastical. But what does tend to happen is top officers in the military, certainly at the level of chief of staff or deputy chief of staff, once they leave the military and once a certain freeze-out period, which this government or one of its predecessors insisted on over a few years expires, then they join the political opposition. That's the interesting dynamic, and that's the background for these rather bizarre announcements.
Yeah, and Dan, what more can you tell us about these tensions between Zamir and Katz in particular? Of course, Zamir had opposed that offensive into Gaza City, but now a ceasefire has been announced. How might this escalate further?
It really all depends on how things go from this point forward, because there's a fork in the road. Down one way leaves a resumption of the war if Israel concludes Hamas is not really respecting the terms, which I remind everyone include a disarming of Hamas and its removal as a governing and military force in Gaza. Then Israel may want to resume the war, and it would need American permission, of course. But that's one potentially catastrophic route. The other is that, the 20-point plan is implemented as Trump claimed had been agreed, although I never heard Hamas actually agree. And then the war ends, and potentially great things come, like peace with Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and Syria for Israel. And the new chapter begins to be written. The tensions will linger for a while because this government is not respected by the establishments in Israel, neither the military nor business establishment, academic, journalistic, I could go on. The so-called elites in Israel, startup nation, the high-tech community, they disdain and often despise the government. And the military is really part of those elites. They tend to be men and women of great quality in the military. The government is a populist government that has, that from the beginning of its term, taking office in late December 2022, immediately launched a process that I call the Putinization of Israel, where they try to, overhaul the system, not just the judiciary, the entire system, to basically give the executive, the government, almost unchecked power, as you have in Turkey, Hungary, as was attempted to be done in Poland, as was completed as a task by Putin in Russia, to the point where Russia is a total dictatorship. The military hated this. And throughout 2023, when the streets of Israel filled with millions of protesters that achieved the rare thing of being a protest that stopped in its tracks a project that a government that did have a Knesset majority was attempting to implement. Throughout that whole time, the heads of the military, the Mossad spy agency, the Shin Bet internal security agency, were attempting to tell Netanyahu that this level of a schism that he has created in Israel by attempting this power grab was projecting weakness and inviting attack. And they were attempting to meet Netanyahu, led by the head of the military. Back then, his name was Herzl Levy. Through July, August, and September of 2023, and Netanyahu refused to meet with him as he continued to pursue his Putinization. And on October 7th, we saw that the invited attack happened.
Yes, Daniel Perry, thank you very much for joining us. Do stay with us here on NewsX World as we bring further updates from the West Asian region. But now we move to Yemen, and Houthi authorities have said that 43 detained United Nations staff will stand trial over alleged links to an Israeli airstrike that killed top Houthi leaders in August. Acting Houthi Foreign Minister Abdul Wahid Abu Ras has said that the investigation into the UN personnel was conducted under full judicial supervision and that the process is now moving towards trial. In August, an Israeli strike on the Houthi-controlled capital Sana'a killed the Prime Minister of the Iran-backed Houthi government, along with several ministers, the first such attack to target senior officials. Abu Ras has claimed a cell within the World Food Programme was directly involved in the targeting, though the UN has strongly denied any connection between its staff or operations and the attack. The World Food Programme has not yet commented on the latest allegations. According to the UN, at least 59 of its personnel are currently detained by the Houthis, who have been accused of arbitrarily arresting aid workers and obstructing humanitarian operations in Yemen. The UN has demanded their immediate release. All the defendants are Yemeni nationals and, under Yemeni law, could face the death penalty if convicted. Let's take a listen in to what United Nations spokesperson Stefan Dujarric had to say on this.
Today, the de facto authorities arbitrarily detain one more of our UN colleagues. This follows the detention of 5 of our co-workers in recent days, including 2 female colleagues, bringing the total number of detainees by the Houthis to at least 59. And as you know, some of them have been held for years. We reiterate our strong condemnation of their continued arbitrary detention by the Houthis.
Dan Perry joins us once again to discuss this. Dan, what do the Houthis get out of arresting United Nations workers, and what does a Houthi trial look like?
Houthi trial is a farce. The Houthis are a terrorist group that hijacked about half of Yemen, rules it by fear, intimidation, and murder, has caused the deaths directly or indirectly of about 500,000 Yemenis over the decade plus of their ruination of the country, and there is no rule of law. On the other hand, when they claim that these workers for various Western NGOs might have helped Israel target them, I don't know, but I don't assume they're lying. I mean, if you are a worker for a do-goodnik Western agency that is trying to undo the chaos and destruction created by these maniacal, diabolical, satanic Houthis, I don't know, you might want to help Israel bomb their installations. I simply don't know, but it's conceivable that they're not lying. What for sure is true is that they're trying to make sure that if this happened, it won't happen again. And in general, that the workers for Western agencies, which by and large are going to be Yemenis, are as fearful of the Houthis as are the other Yemenis. And don't get ideas that just because they work for the World Food Organization, that means they're somehow untouchable from the perspective of the Houthis. It is a great tragedy what's happening in Yemen. I can only hope that the will is found and the forces are amassed to somehow remove these criminals from power. And it's very sad that a bunch more Yemenis are going to be put on trial and quite potentially put to death.
And what can the United Nations do about this? 43 detained 43 detained United Nations staff is a huge number. Of course, all of them Yemeni nationals up for facing the death penalty if found guilty. Some criticise the United Nations for not being powerful enough in today's world. Can any action be taken on this?
The UN generally in its dealings with dictatorships is rather craven and cowardly, and they acquiesce and they almost in some ways legitimize and normalize evil governments in their efforts to offend no one and to be accepted everywhere. So that renders the United Nations a mockery, of course. The United Nations also in the General Assembly daily carries out a circus where the governments of dictatorships that oppress their own people to degrees that are just horrendous and by now well known because of the modern communication landscape have an equal voice to the governments of democracies that oftentimes absurdly are accused by the dictators of various human rights abuses and so forth. The UN is a farce, but the UN has one body that is somewhat different, and that is the Security Council. And the Security Council could, if they wanted to, authorize the use of force against the Houthis. And whereas I'm generally speaking very far from a warmonger, indeed I argued against the Gaza war throughout much of its term, there are times when you must stand up. The problem is that the war carried out against the Houthis by the internationally recognized government of Yemen, which is now sort of in control only of the furthest eastern reaches of the country, along with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, was not successful. But of course, they didn't have much international backing. So the UN, if it wanted to, can try to convene a coalition of the willing, led by Saudi Arabia, and resume the war against the Houthis. It will be ugly, because the Houthis are like Hamas, like in some cases Hezbollah, like Islamic State, a jihadist group that embeds in the population and dares you to end up killing civilians to get at them. And then, of course, they will be crying genocide and claiming that the West is trying to kill the civilians the way they have done against Israel and Gaza. So, not a lot of great options, but that's what the UN could do if they wanted.
Dan Perry, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to get your great insight on these issues. We now head to Europe for our next story, and Russia's Defense Ministry has announced the capture of the village of Novooleksandrivka in Ukraine's Dnipropetrovsk region. This announcement marks another escalation in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war as Moscow's forces continue to press across multiple fronts in eastern Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russia has also launched an overnight attack on the northeastern city of Sumy in Ukraine. National emergency services have said the strikes damaged a multi-storey residential building, private homes and critical infrastructure, which injured 11 people, including 4 children. Additionally, local authorities have reported damage to a railway depot where several carriages were also destroyed. In another related development, local officials have reported that a Ukrainian drone strike has hit a pipeline at a local power plant in Russia's western city of Oryol. Now, this attack has forced the power plant authorities to restrict heat and hot water supplies to its residents. We now move on to further developments from the same conflict, where a major road accident in the Russian city of Tula has reportedly killed 4 people and injured 19 others. Local authorities have said the crash involved a tram, 2 passenger minibuses and 2 cars. According to the Regional Interior Ministry, the collision occurred on the Protolarsk bridge early in the morning today. Emergency crews and traffic inspectors were directed to the scene immediately to clear the area. Investigators are now examining traffic footage and interviewing witnesses to establish the sequence of events. Authorities are yet to determine the exact cause of the accident. We are now joined by Adit Kothari. He's an international affairs expert, and he joins us live from London. Thank you very much, Adit, for joining us here on the programme. It's a pleasure to have you. Now, of course, we report on these strikes every single day. However, something has been coming up more commonly, and that is strikes on energy infrastructure. And now we have seen, of course, this strike which has forced the power plant authorities to restrict heat and hot water supplies to the residents of Russia's western city of Oryol. Why are these strikes becoming more common now, during this time of year especially?
So I think one thing that we need to take cognizance of is that the general infrastructure in Russia is extremely old. These are all sort of infrastructure that were sort of built during the Soviet era. So they do not have the capabilities and the abilities to function in contemporary times, which is why the Ukrainians are basically taking advantage of this. And, with winter-like conditions setting in, we're almost in late October, it's quite, I wouldn't say it's harsh conditions, but it's still quite difficult. And they basically want to ensure that they can make life difficult for the Russian people, which will then, build up pressure on the Russian establishment. The Ukrainian offensive is basically aimed at encircling positions of the Russians and ensure that they have some sort of strategic leverage against the Russians. So that's the whole premise of this, Josh.
Yes, and of course this comes at a time where winter is indeed coming in Eastern Europe and in, of course, that area of the world. Historically, winter has been used as a weapon. It has been in this war in the past. Could you tell me how both the Ukrainians and the Russians will be fighting to use that tactic?
I mean, we've seen how the Russian, the ongoing offensive at this position in Pokrovsk, is basically weakening the Ukrainian defensive, and that is predominantly to gain strategic ground on, positions where Ukrainians, traditionally have been strong, and they're basically using winter as a cover fire to basically ensure that Ukrainian lines of defense is somewhere or the other weakened, and they can cause high amount of casualties, and then hopefully get people to talk peace. So the Russians have been creating that sort of pressure, and they will continue to use winter as a cover fire.
Yes, Adi Kothari, do stay with us for our next story. We now move on over and to the Indo-Pacific, where the United States and the Philippines have launched Task Force Philippines to boost cooperation in the South China Sea. The announcement came during a regional defense summit in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said the task force will increase in interoperability, exercises and readiness to respond to crisis or aggression. He emphasized the strength of the US-Philippine alliance and the importance of mutual defense. On the other hand, Philippine Defense Secretary Gilberto Doltero said the partnership respects international law and sovereignty. He added it aims to protect freedom of navigation and strengthen security in the region for future generations. Let's have a look at what Pete Hegseth and Gilberto Teodoro had to say.
Is understood for what it is, that this is a critically important partnership for us. Our alliance has never been stronger. Our mutual defense treaty is the bedrock of that. We share concerns about China's coercion in the South China Sea, particularly recently in Scarborough Shoal. It bears repeating that mutual defense treaty is critical for both of our countries. Either of our forces anywhere in the South China Sea, it is applicable. And we don't seek confrontation, but of course we're ready to protect our interests individually and mutually. And that's why we're publicly announcing the Task Force Philippines here with you today, which will be another step in our cooperation, increasing interoperability, exercising, and preparedness for contingencies, so that we can decisively respond to crisis or aggression and reestablish deterrence in the South China Sea.
US-Philippine alliance should not be seen in isolation, because the alliance and moving forward now are based on fundamentals. These fundamentals are respect for international law, respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty. And so, as Secretary Hegseth said, it is not only important for both our countries that we interoperate deeper, better, we deter better.
Adit Kothari joins us once again. Adit, of course, Donald Trump met President Xi Jinping yesterday, mainly for trade talks, but also security came up as well, but not Taiwan and not the South China Sea. Of course, this meeting will ring alarm bells in Beijing. How do you analyze that relationship when it comes to trade, but also, of course, America's interest and alliances in the Indo-Pacific, like we have seen here?
I think, this particular meeting and this sort of trade summit coming just after one day of the Trump and Xi sort of meeting. It sort of signals a outreach with the rest of the Southeast Asian countries, where military hardening stance against China is US's strategic policy to create some sort of assertiveness. So, while they're going to be talking about trade with the Chinese counterparts, they will be talking about economic issues. They will be talking about tariffs and supply chains and market access and those kind of things, to ensure that they have continued pressure mounted on the Chinese. They will be talking to the other Southeast Asian countries, including South Korea, Japan, and Philippines. Philippines has been one of those major countries where US has leveraged its sort of military abilities. Right, going back to 1951. I mean, you will recall, when Pete Hegseth was basically talking about his task force updates, he used the word reestablishment. The reestablishment of deterrence is going back to 1951. So that's when the sort of mutual treaty came into existence, and they have been part of this military exercise to ensure that any sort of Chinese incursions, which has increased over the time, can be deterred of and can be sort of disengaged. Josh.
Yes, Adit Kothari, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. Pleasure to have you. Now we move on, and the United Nations is condemning recent US military strikes on boats allegedly carrying illegal drugs in the Caribbean Sea and the Eastern Pacific Ocean. UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk called the attacks unacceptable and demanded that they stop immediately. UN spokesperson Ravina Shamdasani said the strikes violate international human rights law. Let's take a listen in.
Strikes by the United States of America on boats in the Caribbean and in the Pacific violate international human rights law. Over 60 people have reportedly been killed in a continuing series of attacks carried out by US armed forces against boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific since early September, in circumstances that the UN Human Rights Chief says find no justification in international law.
She added that lethal force can only be used as a last resort against an imminent threat to life. The United Nations is now calling for a full investigation. Meanwhile, the United States under President Donald Trump has defended the airstrikes as a necessary escalation to curb drug trafficking from South America. Now, in the United Kingdom, King Charles has stripped his younger brother Andrew of his title of the Prince and forced him out of his Windsor home, Buckingham Palace, and seeking to distance the royals from Andrew over his links to Jeffrey Epstein's scandal. Andrew, the younger brother of Charles and second son to the late Queen Elizabeth II, has come under the mounting pressure in recent years over his behaviour and ties to the late sex offender. Some locals have reacted to this. Let's take a listen.
He doesn't deserve it. He's wrong. He shouldn't have done what he did. And he should be sent to the US to face the charges that he should face.
I think it's a good idea. I think just because of his family doesn't mean that he shouldn't be held responsible for potentially his past actions. And I think that the fact that the royal family decided to actually go against him is quite a big thing.
Meanwhile, Charles has now escalated his actions against Andrew by stripping him of all his titles, leaving him to be known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. Well, that's all that we have time for. Keep watching NewsX World for more news updates from